matter that much that we take these 2,000 troops out?
It'll matter in the narrow counterterrorism effort. The idea that you've defeated terrorists and they go away, no, that's not the way it works. They'll reconstitute themselves, so that will come back. That will be a decision either he or his successor will rue. The American people could well pay a price for it. In terms of the future of Syria, long ago we'd accommodated ourselves to the reality that this government, this regime wasn't going anywhere. The question now, I think, is whether the United States and others can use the incentive of economic help for rebuilding to try to bring about a degree of political reform, a bit of restraint on the part of Mr. Assad before he and others settle any scores. But the fact that we don't have 2,000 troops there obviously reduces our leverage.
Afghanistan, reports are that we're going to drop by 50%. That worries me because it feels like Afghanistan is actually a moderate success in that we have kept the country sort of together.
Right.
And what I worry about is if we destabilize the government, that is a case where we know who will take advantage. The Chinese have been waiting to have greater and greater control of Afghanistan.
No, you'll see basically the Pakistanis, the Chinese, terrorists, all this. The Taliban will come back. That can't be good. I think we have to understand our goal in Afghanistan can't be to win. We're not going to turn the place into Switzerland, but simply to keep it from falling apart, because we saw what happened back when, just before 9/11, when that happened. Unfortunately, we are now on a trajectory where the possibility of Syria's backsliding is real. And again, we can't insulate ourselves from that. I don't understand why it's so difficult for people to understand that what happens elsewhere can sooner or later, or will sooner or later, affect the quality and security or prosperity of life here. I would have thought 9/11 was enough of a class in that, but I'm afraid we may have to basically learn that experience again the hard way.
One final thought. You've worked in 4 administrations. I'm told that a third of the spots at the NSC are empty, something like that in the National Economic Council. Key White House positions are not being filled. What is that? It feels like really a kind of chaotic and very thinly staffed White House.
Well, it feels that way because it is. And then Mr. Trump he tends not to use what little staff he has. And I think one of the lessons of the last week or so is process matters. Process is there to protect. It's meant to inform people, to say, hey, if you do this, there's a decent chance this will come of it. Are you sure you want to do that? And by not having the place staffed up, by not using the staff that you do have, by essentially flying by your gut, the United States dramatically increases the odds that bad decisions will be taken, and then there won't be any serious execution or implementation. Government's hard. Foreign policy is hard, particularly in this world where so many others have such power. And the idea that a president wouldn't totally staff himself up and use the resources around him, from the CIA to the Pentagon to the State Department, it's like going to a card table and basically say, oh, don't deal me all the cards. I'm prepared to play 5-card stud with only 3 cards. Not a very smart way to play the game.
Richard Haass, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
It may seem like a frightening time for America and the world, but is it really? Is it perhaps actually the greatest time to be alive? Are those two options in conflict? 2 terrific scholars, Neil Ferguson and Steve Pinker, have a discussion and a debate when we come back.
Want a daily dose of Fareed and his team? Now you can get it with Fareed's Global Briefing, the newsletter that gives you the best insight and analysis on global affairs. Go to cnn.com/Fareed to sign up.
Of impeachment, tonight at 8.
Now, for a moment, let's put aside the details of border walls and shutdowns, threats of Syria, North Korea, nuclear weapons, AR-15s, shrinking sea ice, rising Ebola infections, and look at the big picture of the world today. Are we in a dark moment, as it may seem to you if you read the front page of most newspapers or spend a few minutes on Twitter on any given day? Or are we in one of the best periods in all of humanity, where a few bad trends overshadow all the good news? Well, it's a big, crucial debate, and we are going to have it here today. Steven Pinker is a professor of psychology at Harvard and a best-selling author, perhaps best known for his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And Neil Ferguson is a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and also a best-selling author. His latest is The Square and the Tower. 2 terrific scholars. I'm delighted to have you both. Stephen, let me start with you, because you feel as though that there's almost a kind of systematic way in which we ignore good news and overemphasize bad news in the media. Explain what you mean.
Well, the nature of journalism is going to emphasize the negative because bad things can happen quickly. But good things aren't built in a day, and they can creep up on us by stealth. So if something explodes, if there is a shooting, if a building collapses, that's news. But if the global extreme poverty rate declines by a few percentage points, there's never a Thursday in October in which it happens, in which it makes the headlines. But when you track the data year by year, you see that the world can be transformed.
Chaos for Christmas. The Dow plunging and paychecks on hold as President Trump's wall shuts down the federal government. And the president contradicts himself.
I will be the one to shut it down. Call it a Democrat shutdown.
Which party will pay the political price?
Prosperous and progressive, in the sense of greater and greater rights for more and more people in human history, correct?
Yeah, and it's not a matter of what I think, it's what the data show. Now, of course, these improvements don't happen inexorably year after year after year. There are always wiggles and bumps. Sometimes there are nasty surprises. But the overall trend over the decades, over the centuries, is for every measure of human well-being to improve.
Neil Ferguson, what is your response to that?
Well, I don't violently disagree with Steve that the world is a good deal better at the end of 2018 than it was 100 years ago, or for that matter, 50 years ago. There have been enormous improvements in most economic measures. Even inequality, which is something that people worry about a lot, has actually gone down globally, not least because of the extraordinary economic miracle in the world's most populous country, China. Where I disagree with Steve is the inference that he draws about the future, because you could equally well have published a book a little along the same lines as Steve's in, say, 1911, and it would have been true that the world was significantly better in 1911 than it had been in 1811. But that wouldn't have been a reason to be naively optimistic about the future, because you were just 3 years away from a cataclysm in the form of World War I. And indeed, the middle decades of the 20th century were catastrophic for really large proportions of humanity. So I think the right way to think about this is that history does have some very pleasing trend lines when it comes to economic welfare and indeed to conflict, another thing that Steve emphasizes. But history teaches us to watch out for sudden discontinuities. And in a highly networked, highly integrated world of the sort that we've built in the last 30 years, there are enormous vulnerabilities. So the story could change from a good news story to a bad news story in a day, and that would not be fake news if it were a global pandemic of the sort that the world was struck by at the end of the First World War. So I don't entirely agree with Steve in the sense that sometimes there really is bad news, and history doesn't necessarily prepare you for it.
Steve, let me pick up on the point Neil was making. So in 1911, of course, there was such a book written. It was Norman Angel's The Great Illusion, international bestseller, in which he said essentially war will never happen again. It was more complicated.
Did not say that.
He said not say that. He said that he thought it would be so expensive they wouldn't pay, but it was read by many. It was read by many people to mean that wars are not going to break out. And the point is, you had World War I, you had the great flu epidemic in which more people died than in many countries in World War I. You had the Great Depression. You had Stalin and his madness. You had the Second World War. And then you had Mao and his madness. So from 1914 to 1954, let's say, it certainly looked like it was a pretty bleak period.
It did. Now, and by the way, Norman Angel did not predict that war could not happen. He just predicted if it did happen.
But many people read the book and said that because it represented what seemed like a century of peace and progress that had taken place.
Well, only if you look at certain parts of Europe. It wasn't so peaceful in the United States, which had the worst war in its history, the Civil War. Wasn't so peaceful in China, which had the worst civil war in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. Not so peaceful in Southern Africa, which had the conquest of Shaka.
Well, then you're making my point. I'm not quite sure. The point I'm trying to make is that despite that illusion of peace, the next 30 years prove to be war-filled, violent, bloody.
Yes, and it can happen. And I'm not predicting that it can't happen. No one could predict that. But of course, one could also make predictions of impending doom repeatedly. That also turned out to be false. If you pick, for example, predictions that I grew up with, that World War III between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable, it would be a nuclear war. If you look at predictions after 9/11, that there were going to be weekly massive terrorist attacks, that shoulder-launched missiles were going to shoot planes out of the sky, that there are going to be massive explosions at football matches. If you look at predictions in the early 90s, that a new generation of super predators was going to shoot the crime rate up just before it plunged, you can have false predictions in both directions. And I'm not making a prediction that these positive trends will necessarily continue, but we should inform our predictions by which way the trend lines have been going, while being aware of the possibility of nasty surprises.
All right, we got to take a break. When we come back, I will ask Neil Ferguson to make the best prediction he can about the future. And we are back with Steven Pinker and Neil Ferguson talking about the world. Is it falling to pieces or better than ever? Neil, let me ask you to give us a sense of where you think the world is going, because you and I have had this debate where I was sort of taking Steve Pinker's side in Toronto, and I recall some of the points you were making, which I thought were quite valid, which was that, you know, if you look at the world from the point of view of the state of democracy, there seems to be a retreat both in important countries and smaller countries. If you look at the support for kind of international order, what was often called the liberal international order, that seems to be declining. You see the rise of nationalism, populism, or many political trend lines don't seem as positive as they might have 10 years ago, correct?
I think there's some truth in what you say, Fareed, though I'm careful in saying that there are very clear trends with respect to, say, democracy. The trend that I'm most interested in, which I think has the greatest potential to disrupt democratic and undemocratic societies, is our trend towards being a networked world. Because one of the arguments I made in the Square and the Tower, I think, has been vindicated, that by creating a highly integrated network world online with giant network platforms such as Facebook and Google, we've created a much less stable public sphere in which fake news and extreme views are in fact proliferated because of the way that the algorithms work and the business models of these companies. Now that's a trend that is disrupting all kinds of different countries, from the United States all the way to Myanmar, in ways that I think are actually quite troubling. And I don't think we have a good answer to the question, what do we do to preserve democracy and the rule of law in an age of institutionalized fake news on social media? That seems to me a big worry. And coming back to the discussion we had a moment ago with Steve, if you're asking the question, what could possibly go wrong with this best of all possible worlds, the thing that I think is most likely to go wrong is that the unintended consequences of highly globalized, highly integrated platforms are likely to be disruptive in a whole range of dimensions, disrupting our politics, potentially also disrupting financial markets, if you think about some of the impacts that technology can have there, and ultimately even disrupting the climate of the planet. It wouldn't take much to derail the trend lines that Steve talks about in his books. And that's why I'm fascinated by the one law of history that really matters, and that's the law of unintended consequences. Nobody who built Facebook expected that it would be a decisive variable in the election of Donald Trump, but it was.
That is certainly true, although whenever there is a new medium, such as the printing press, there's often a period of a kind of Wild West where apocryphal stories, conspiracy theories proliferate until the system kind of recalibrates and mounts an immune response and figures out how to control it. We haven't done that yet with the rise of social media, but when the printing press originated, there were fake books of the Bible being disseminated. We had the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which blamed the world's problems on a Jewish conspiracy. There was massive plagiarism, fake authors. Eventually, a regime settled into place that got rid of the worst excesses. It remains to be seen whether we will fail to implement implement that in the case of social media.
But tell me how you'd respond.
Steve, that was after 130 years of religious conflict that the printing press undoubtedly fueled. It took a long time to get from Martin Luther to the Peace of Westphalia. And I think one of the lessons of our time is that analogy that you've just made is very good, that in many ways the personal computer and the internet have done the same to our era as the printing press did to the 16th and 17th centuries. But that's a disquieting thing, because it really did produce polarization, epidemics of crazy ideas. You didn't mention the best example, which is the idea that witches live amongst us, which went completely viral on both sides of the Atlantic, and led to thousands of people being horribly killed for absolutely no good reason. That seems to me a reason to be quite cautious about where we're going from here. It may not be 130 years of religious conflict, but we could certainly have, say, 13 years of really bitter ideological political conflict, with the potential that it shades over from verbal violence, which we currently have plenty of on the internet, to actual violence. That's a reason to worry, I think. Steve's great peril is that one day future historians will look back and they will cite Steve Pinker, the way historians today cite Norman Angell, as somebody who was, broadly speaking, too confident in the trends and underestimated the black swan, low probability, high impact events that can completely change the historical trajectory.
All right, I have to give you a short response since Neil asked you directly. Will you be cited like Norman Angell?
Well, not to anyone who reads me, because I do talk about thick-tailed distributions, about low probability, high impact, and yes, they can occur.
Now you can get it with Fareed's
Global. Predict that
to sign up.
Impossible, just that it would be ruinous, and he was right.
On that note, good news and bad news. I just have to thank both of you. It was a really fascinating discussion, wonderful way to close out the year. Thank you both. Next on GPS, President Trump says he's not building an ugly concrete wall on the Mexican border. No, he tweeted, he plans to build a wall of artistically designed steel slats. It will, he says, be beautiful. But ugly or beautiful, what can the world teach us about walls and whether or not they work?